So here we are, Season 6, the final Triton era season. We have 7 serials left for his era, with this season beginning with a 5-parter, something the show hasn't done before, and the first time since Season 2 that a season didn't begin with a 4-parter. So it's a longer serial to open it, but a serial which was planned to be even longer. I'll go into that later and also discuss how this serial played a part in changing the end of this season, but let's get into this serial and see what the Dominators has got. So we begin in space as a fleet of ships head towards the planet Dulcis, home to the Dulcians, a race who we later learn are completely peaceful. One ship lands and we are introduced to the Dominators, with the two we meet being Navigator Rhaego and Probationer Toba. So there's somehow both a lot and a little to say about these two. They have an interesting dynamic but are somewhat boring individually. We don't meet any other Dominators outside of these two, but as a species they have conquered several galaxies and dominate entire civilizations. Their history of a species or their greater empire isn't too gone into, but their name is very on the nose. Because of this, the species isn't very interesting, which means it all comes down to the two we have, who as I've already said aren't the most interesting individually. On their dynamic you have the younger and older one. Toba is the younger one who is very violent and will attack anything instantly, and on the other hand you have Rhaego, who has served as a dominator for far longer and spends time trying to understand the species they are attacking. The best scene of this is where they find a museum and examine the exhibited weapons. Toba focuses on the fact that the weapons are primitive, while Rhaego points out that they are old, and so the species must have developed more powerful weapons. There is something interesting here, even if the dynamic is quite an old and overused one. Their clash of personalities causes them to argue often, and this gives time for the trio and the Dulcians to take action against them, leading to their defeat. They're both enjoyable to watch when they interact with other characters, but there isn't too much to say about each of them. They are quite surface level characters. So we don't know much about their technology which allowed them to conquer galaxies, but we know a little about their ships and more importantly their robot servants, the Quarks. The Quarks are short robots which can barely walk but do all the work of the Dominators. They are equipped with force units and powerful weapons which can somewhat destroy buildings, but are very good at killing humanoid life. There really isn't anything to say about them other than they were played by children. There is one thing about them which I won't talk about yet, as this is a part of a bigger talking point which I'll get into. So on to the Dulcians, who are somewhat interesting, and by interesting I mean they're being used to push a theme instead of being interesting as characters, with one exception. So there are quite a few Dulcians in the serial, with us seeing quite a range of different ones, in terms of their place in society. At the bottom we have Cully, who is a man who takes people to the island of death, and he is also the son of the director Senec, who is the leader of the Dulcian people, but I'll come back to him. Then we have Kando and Teal, who are students and who are studying the island alongside their mentor Balan. Then of course we have the top with the council, led by Senec, who dictate the entire Dulcian race. So these three distinct groups of people do build a deeper world than most, and it is good to see a more varied class of people, although in Dulcian society it's unlikely that classes even exist as we know of them. I'll look at the council when I examine the serial's theme. For now I'll discuss the expedition team in the island. The expedition are studying the radiation levels on the island of death. This is due to 172 years ago, the Dulcians tested out nuclear weaponry and the island was destroyed. This caused them to turn away from any sort of nuclear energy. They had previously set up a museum on the island to warn people about violence and war, which is no longer visitable. The expedition team are one of many that come to the island to study it, but in this case they find the trio, Cully and the Dominators. The people in the research team aren't the most interesting, but their reaction to the trio is interesting, where they just accept they're aliens without any questions just because they can't disprove it at that moment in time. Although as soon as Cully arrives they change their tune completely, and think that they are his companions. Although the one big issue with this is nobody points out or even notices that everyone on this planet wears the same outfits, but the trio are wearing stuff that is completely unlike it. This is something which really bugs me in this serial, as it's so obvious they aren't Dulcians because of this, but that's a minor nitpick in the grand scheme. So these three aren't the most interesting characters in the serial. They serve two purposes in the story, with the first to act as the human connection, with them being the ones to react to the situations around them and to the Dominators. The other is to be the ones suffering while the council do nothing, which works into the serial's commentary. Now I'll discuss the commentary, as that basically sums up everything on the Dulcians. So this serial is a commentary on the hippie movement of the late 60s. What we have is a group being invaded by aliens and refusing to take any violent action against them, with the serial suggesting that violent action is necessary against violence. It is interesting to see the show take this viewpoint, but it feels a bit underwhelming because the Dulcians aren't that interesting. While we do understand that they are a peaceful people, I find the fact that they are a bit too into the lifestyle of complete peace is weird. Like they don't even have any minor scuffles between people, so they feel a bit unreal. The only person who is willing to do anything is Cully, and that's without any development. So it's unfortunate that there is nobody else who shares this viewpoint and is on the edge but holds back due to this being how their people are. Imagine a council member who is more willing to take action but doesn't because he is the only one. They could be quite an interesting character in the story, but instead the council members aren't interesting. The only one that's somewhat notable is the director because he's the head of the council and the father of Cully, but that doesn't make him an interesting character. There are other council members who get fun lines, but that's it. I don't know their names or anything about them which could make them interesting. The only other notable member of the council is Tensa, because he's played by Brian Cant and has a bit of personality. He is somewhat fleshed out in terms of him having a bigger place in Dulcian society, as his past achievements are talked about by the council, but he still feels very minimal, and like with the last character played by Kant, he is killed. So I'm not familiar with the hippie movement, and so when I first watched the serial, I saw it as a more general commentary on people who refuse to defend themselves, which is a fair viewpoint of this serial in a world which is far off from the hippie movement. Now, it's an interesting view of the world to explore, as there are many sides to it. Should someone use violence to defend themselves, or should they sit by while they're being attacked? Or to what extent should violence be used by someone to defend themselves? The serial goes with the idea of resisting through violence, with the Doctor pushing this idea and trying to get the Dulcians to stand up for themselves, with the Council continuing to resist the idea throughout, even when someone is killed right in front of them. This is where the expedition team comes into play, with them acting as the ones to change. This is obviously due to them being in the direct line of fire, with them being the ones put to work by the Dominators, and even tortured and killed. I also think this dynamic gives the serial another view for commentary, because another interpretation of this serial could be that this is about the narrow-minded view of the people who rule against those who are affected by the problems. I think nowadays this is perhaps a more relevant view of the serial due to a hippie movement being so far off from us. How the world works nowadays, the people at the top feel so distant from those at the bottom, and this serial has that feeling. The council do nothing and won't even send people to investigate the situation, while the people on the island are suffering. Of course, this is just my interpretation of what's being presented within my experience of the world, and I think when the serial can give you the ability to draw your own conclusions about what it's saying, then it's doing something right, and isn't exactly stuck in its time. So let's talk about the main cast, starting with the Doctor. As per usual, he's as strong as ever, but in this serial he spends almost the entire thing being an idiot. This is due to the Dominators being quite stupid and unable to see through his lie, plus never challenging him in a way that would make him reveal his intelligence. It is fun to see him acting this way throughout, this beginning with the interrogation scene where he pretends he can't do a simple block puzzle. It really weakens the Dominators due to this though. They don't seem anywhere near as competent as the species who have dominated galaxies should feel, but at the same time, just seeing the Doctor acting like this for not just an episode or two is amazing, and is so fun to watch. Especially the ending scene where he runs across the wasteland in a Looney Tunes-esque scene to put the Dominators' bomb into their ship. This is such a stupid moment in the serial, which makes it so funny, which goes for a lot of the Doctor's scenes in the serial. The scenes of the travel capsule are notable, where he's eating a bag of sweets and then scrambling over the seats with his legs in the air to try and mess with the wiring. These little scenes with the Doctor acting this way really lighten the mood of the serial, which works against some of the darker stuff in it, but at the same time actually gives you something to remember. On Jamie, the serial gives him a lot to do. He spends a decent chunk of the serial acting as a part of a comedy duo with the Doctor, before being involved in a lot of the later action, with him destroying many of the quarks. But that's mostly it for him. He has a lot of action and quite a few jokes, but he is mostly secondary to the Doctor. He does get a bit where he's alone with Cully where they're trapped underground, which are good scenes as we get to see the two of them bonding a bit, but that's about it. These scenes also act more to introduce the bunker. So that's about all there is to say about Jamie. He is good in this serial, especially when paired with the Doctor, but even alone he stands out. Finally we have Zoe, who is somewhat strong here. This is her first serial on an alien planet, and she spends a lot of time with the Dulcians instead of the Doctor and Jamie. But this is good as it allows her to spend time in this alien environment, trying to convince them to fight and stand up for themselves. While this does limit her dynamic with the others, it means that she gets time to stand on her own as a character, which is good. Now this limited time with the Doctor and Jamie is rectified a bit at the end when she spends more time with them, but not as much with Jamie, who spent a lot of the last episode fighting the quarks instead of with the others. Their dynamic is unfortunately left very undeveloped by the serial, but since they got a bit of time together in Wheel, it means it's not as bad as their lack of development could have been. But since this is a season opener, it should have the two of them showing off this dynamic. But she gets plenty of time with the Doctor, which is good, as she was lacking that in the previous serial, with them having some great scenes, especially towards the end of the serial. The best is them putting together some explosives and the Doctor being careless.
But whatever you do, and this is important, you must throw it before 10 seconds have elapsed.
7.
Liable to blow...
8. Doctor!
Their dynamic does have places to go, but is relatively unexplored here. Now I've neglected to talk about the Dominator's plan, and that's because it's really silly. So their ships require nuclear energy to run, but have no way to generate it. So what they do is they go to a planet, drop a nuclear bomb into the core and cause the entire planet to explode in an atomic fireball, which they can take the energy from. This is completely stupid and definitely has no scientific basis whatsoever. Now that goes for a lot of Doctor Who serials, but it feels so obvious in this one. And since it's not being supported by a strong script or characters, it means that it really stands out. But it does give us the stupid ending with the Doctor running across the wasteland, so it's got that at least. Plus there is one other detail to note about this bit of the plot line, and that's the second appearance of the sonic screwdriver, which is now presented as a pen light, and we learn can be equipped with a trigger mechanism, which turns it into a laser cutter, something it will do one more time in the entire show. Now for the behind the scenes, there's quite a few things to talk about, so let's begin with something strange, and that's that Troughton doesn't seem to have been present for the location filming, as he clearly has a double standing in for him, and I have no idea why. Now onto the script. So the serial was originally meant to be a 6-parter, but due to the pace it was decided to cut it down to a 5-parter, with episode 5 being rewritten to add an ending to it. These rewrites were done by script editor Derek Sherwin and his assistant Terence Dix. This also leads into who the serial's actual writers are, as Norman Ashby is a pseudonym, with the writers being Mervyn Haseman and Henry Lincoln, the writers of The Abominable Snowmen and The Web of Fear. And this leads into the controversy of the quarks, which is what had an effect on the season finale. So the quarks were envisioned as another attempt to create a creature that could recreate the success of the Daleks. Now obviously this didn't happen, but there was an argument over the copyright, as obviously both the writers and the BBC wanted ownership of them. This disagreement would lead to a later script the two were working on being pulled as they left the show behind them, this script being titled The Laird of Maccrimmon, which was envisioned as the penultimate serial of the season and would have written out Jamie, plus we've seen the return of the Yeti and the Great Intelligence, presumably with its final defeat. Whether this season will have been better or worse with the serial in it is unknown, but when we get towards the end of the season, we'll have a better idea. So overall, The Dominators is a very mixed bag. It has plenty of funny moments, but the script is really weak, with its message having lost its effect all these years later, but perhaps has gained a new interpretation because of this. It leaves a lot to be desired, but definitely feels a bit long at times, and to think at one point it was meant to be a 6-parter is hard to imagine. It's definitely the weakest script of the writing duo, and a really bad one to go out on. But with the trio now in danger of a volcanic eruption, they have no choice but to escape to another dimension, where they find themselves in the dangerous land of fiction. Next time, The Mind Robber.